So hello everybody. So while Nick is connecting his laptop into the system, I'm very glad to introduce him. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you, Gergely. So I apologize about this hiccup. Nick is a wonderful colleague. So we are colleagues for 5 or 6 years now, and he actually was a Princeton student. He's from Alaska. So he has a wonderful website, and I strongly suggest you to read. This shows his personality, and also shows some of his excellent research. Nick Longrich, and he has his www.nicklongrich.com website. So Nick was a college student at Princeton. His supervisor actually was Rosemary Grant. Some of you even met Rosemary when she was in Debrecen a few years ago. And Rosemary had very great memories about Nick as a student. And then he went to Yale to do a PhD on dinosaurs, and then spent a few years as postdoc in Chicago. And about 5 or 6 years ago, he got to Bath. He quickly got a research fellowship and then a full-time position at Bath. He's a wonderful colleague. He spent a lot of time in the field. He largely goes to Morocco, Mexico for looking for different specimens. And he's very good coming up with interesting ideas very few people have done before. So Nick, all yours. I need to dash in about half an hour because I have another meeting, but I very much, until then, I look forward hearing your stories. Yeah, nice to see you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a duckbill dinosaur from Africa. And this might not initially seem like the most staggeringly important find in the world, but it turns out to actually have some pretty interesting implications for understanding biogeography in general. And I'm going to kind of try and talk about that here today. So to summarize, at the end of the Cretaceous period, around 66 million years ago, the world has been isolated by tens of millions of years of continental drift and very high sea levels driven by volcanic eruptions. And as a result of that, we have the evolution of endemic dinosaur faunas. So we don't have the same dinosaurs everywhere. We have different dinosaurs in different continents because everything's isolated. And we have the appearance in North America of a fauna that's dominated by the duckbill dinosaurs and tyrannosaurs, and in North America and in Asia. And we have very distinct faunas in the southern hemisphere and what the remains of what's the supercontinent of Gondwana. So in South America, Madagascar, India, and Africa, we have faunas dominated by these long-necked titanosaurian sauropods. And shoot, I think it's got timings or something on here. So we have these different dinosaurs in the southern continents. And what we've got here is a dinosaur more characteristic of the northern continents, a duckbill dinosaur. This is a North American lineage, somehow appearing in Africa. And to me, that suggests that we need to rethink biogeography, and the patterns driving biogeography in the Cretaceous and in the Cenozoic are very different than the ones we've typically thought of. But actually, they'd be patterns quite familiar to Darwin and Wallace. So we're going to go all the way back to the start of the Mesozoic period, around 250 million years ago. And at this time, this is just after the end Permian mass extinction, but before the dinosaurs have even evolved, we have all the continents united into this giant C-shaped landmass, the supercontinent of Pangaea. So everything is united together in this giant, kind of crescent-shaped landmass. In the middle, we have a seaway called the Tethys Sea. And then what happens is it starts to break up. We have the fragmentation of Pangaea. The first thing that happens is the North Atlantic forms. We have Africa and Europe breaking away from Eastern North America. And we have the split of the Pangaea into this northern landmass called Laurasia and a southern landmass called Gondwana. And so by around 160 million years ago, in the middle of the Jurassic period, we have this initial isolation. And as a result of this, the dinosaur fauna start to evolve in very different ways in the two places. We continue to have more and more breakup. So the next thing that happens is that East Gondwana breaks off of West Gondwana. So East Gondwana is Madagascar, India, Australia, Antarctica. That splits apart. And then we have Africa and South America still united, and then they're split apart by the formation of the South Atlantic. So at this point, we have a high degree of continental isolation around about 100 million years ago. And by the end of the Cretaceous period, around 75 to 66 million years ago, we have extraordinary degrees of isolation of these continental land masses. So we don't have our modern 7 continents. We have a series of smaller land masses isolated by water, and they're island continents like Australia is today. So South America is isolated, Africa is isolated, possibly even 2 different land masses. Madagascar is an island continent, has remained so until now. India is an island continent, Australia, Antarctica, these are all island continents, Eastern North America, and then a series of continents in Europe. So we have a whole bunch of different isolated land masses. As a result of this, we see the evolution of distinct faunal provinces. So the typical dinosaur fauna that you think of from the very end of the Cretaceous is tyrannosaurids, horned dinosaurs, and duckbill dinosaurs. And this is typical for parts of the world. So in North America, this is what dominates. There's a land bridge to Asia, so we have similar faunas in Asia. And one of the most diverse, important components of this fauna are these duckbill dinosaurs. These are herbivorous dinosaurs. They have a beak in front and these complex dental batteries in the back of their jaws. They use to grind plants. They can walk on 2 legs or on 4 legs. They're very, very common. They're kind of called the cows of the Cretaceous because they're so ridiculously common out there in these rocks. In the southern continents, we see things evolving in a very different way, though, however. So these long-necked dinosaurs that dominated the Jurassic period, they persist in the southern continents. These are sauropod dinosaurs. And this one sauropod lineage, the titanosaurs, are very important. And then we have a distinct lineage of carnivores as well. These are called abelosaurs. They're more primitive than tyrannosaurs, but in some ways more specialized. Abelosaurs actually have shorter arms than tyrannosaurs do. So abelosaur arms make tyrannosaur arms look long. And they have these weird short little bulldog snouts. They're very, very weird animals. So this is what's dominating at the same time we have T-Rex and duckbill dinosaurs and Triceratops in North America. This very different fauna. And this at least is the picture as I understood it a few years ago when I started working in Morocco. And Morocco is a really interesting place to look for fossils. And it's mostly interesting for in terms of what it preserves about the marine ecosystem at the time. So at the time, because of these very high sea levels, the seaway came in past Casablanca all the way up to what is now the Atlas Mountains. This is all underwater, and it's a shallow seaway in a subtropical latitudes, and it's got an upwelling zone there. So we have the trade winds are pushing the surface waters off to the west, bottom waters upwell, bringing all this phosphorus and minerals and to the surface. And we have this extraordinarily productive marine ecosystem. And all the marine animals that lived there died and sank to the bottom. And so we have things like fish bone and fish scales and shark teeth and marine reptile bones. And this is calcium phosphate, bone in an animal. It's fertilizer. So these phosphate deposits of this ancient marine ecosystem are today mined. This is, I believe, the largest phosphate mines in the world. It's economically very important for fertilizers and phosphoric acid for various industrial processes. And so this is incredibly economically important. In the process of digging up these ancient seabeds to use them for fertilizer, an extraordinarily rich fauna has emerged. So most of it is these very small, isolated things. If you see shark teeth for sale in a museum, gift store, or in a fossil shop, it's usually from these mines in Morocco. And so most of the fauna looks like this, little isolated bones. Occasionally, larger and more complete things come out, like this animal. So this is a creature we described a few years ago. It's called Thalassatitan, and it's a mosasaur. It's not a dinosaur, but a giant sea lizard. And this is kind of the apex predator of the ecosystem, sort of like a modern orca. And we've been going through these deposits, trying to reconstruct the marine ecosystem in the final moments of the Cretaceous before the asteroid hit. And we found this extraordinarily rich marine reptile fauna with something like maybe 20 or 30 different species of mosasaurs, and then plesiosaurs, sharks, fish, and sea turtles on top of that. So this is kind of what I went over there to do, was to understand these marine ecosystems. But as often happens in science, it throws you a bit of a curveball, and you get something completely unexpected. And this is just, but I guess that was also kind of part of the strategy. Go over there in Africa where we know very little and see what comes up, see what the fossil record will surprise us with. And one of the really surprising things is that out of this marine ecosystem, we're now getting a dinosaur fauna, and it is the best dinosaur fauna from the end of the Cretaceous in Africa. Now, obviously, dinosaurs are not very common in marine ecosystems. They're a very, very small percentage of the fossils in the marine record. But these fossils are so abundant over there. We're seeing thousands of mosasaurs, millions of shark teeth, that even though dinosaurs are a small fragment, a small fraction of this fauna, if you look at enough fossils, you start seeing dinosaurs. And over the years, we've slowly put together the fauna. So we discovered, for example, this abelosaur, this animal called Tyrannosaurus. We're also working on some titanosaurs. And up until now, it's been kind of so far so good. This sort of confirms what we thought about the southern dinosaur faunas. They're very different from the North American ones, and they have this sort of southern flavor. And then a few years ago, a fossil came up that really sort of blew me away. And I was going through a little rock shop and looking at the bones there, and I saw this little thing, and I took one look at it, and I just could not believe what I was seeing. And this thing really astonished me. Not because I didn't know what it was, but because I did know exactly what it was, and I just couldn't believe that I was actually seeing what I was seeing. So this little fragment of bone, you take a closer look at it, and I saw these distinctive teeth. And these are the teeth of a duckbill dinosaur. So they've got enamel on only one side of the tooth. They have a ridge running down the middle. They have a couple, the carinae, the serrated ridges on either side. They're packed into these batteries. And I knew what this was because I'd seen a lot of these things going through collections and out in the field. So as a grad student, I would go to Dinosaur Provincial Park and wander around there, and you would see duckbill dinosaur bones eroding out of the cliffs. And here is the femur of a duckbill dinosaur. I saw this many years ago when I was a grad student, and I guarantee you that specimen is still out there today because duckbill dinosaurs are so incredibly common. There is not time enough to collect them all. There is not enough space in the museums to put them, even if you could collect them all. So there's something like, I don't know, maybe 100 or 200 duckbill dinosaur skeletons in varying degrees of completeness that are out there in this formation now, and they're just not collected because they're so common. And so they don't really get a lot of attention. People aren't as excited by them as the tyrannosaurs. They were the horned dinosaurs. People like dinosaurs with pointy bits, with horns and sharp teeth and claws, and they're kind of non-threatening. So they're like, they don't get a lot of, for example, they don't get a lot of attention in Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park has all the big dangerous dinosaurs, and duckbills are kind of, not really featured. To give you an example, many years ago, I was out in Dinosaur Park, actually my first time in the field, and we're walking back from a dig site, and I looked up at the cliff, and I saw this jawbone there with all the teeth in place. Over 100 teeth in place, this beautiful, pristine jawbill from a duckbill dinosaur. I said, wow, look at that. And the person I was with said, yeah, come on, Nick, we're busy. Stop wasting time. I think they were kind of flaunting a bit how rich the record was out there. But there's so many duckbill dinosaurs, they're basically never collected. That, however, is very different from the situation in Africa. So duckbill dinosaurs are extraordinarily common in North America, where they evolved. We'd never seen anything like this in Africa before. And it was really just didn't seem like it could or should be there. Again, Africa is isolated at the end of the Cretaceous, so how did duckbill dinosaur even get there? And it seemed impossible. But when we put this fossil together, we had several different fragments we were able to glue together to kind of create this jaw and get a picture of what these animals looked like. Here's the lower jaw. You can see these slots. So they have stacks of teeth. The teeth are kind of stacked one on top of another to kind of create this complex dental battery. And when you do some detailed comparisons, what you can see is that not only do we have a duckbill dinosaur, it has these features like the elongate posterior dentigerous process that makes it a duckbill dinosaur. It has certain features that unite specifically with a group called the Lambeosaurinae. And the Lambeosaurs are the crested duckbills. They have these big kind of hollow crests that they can, they're used as resonating structures to make sounds with, like horns, basically. And specifically, it appeared to be most closely related to the duckbill dinosaurs, the Lambeosaurines from Europe, from Spain and from France. So this was really, really interesting. So we reconstructed the evolutionary tree of the duckbill dinosaurs. You can see most of the tree here is red. That's North America. That's the color code for North America, where we believe the duckbill dinosaurs originated. Then we have some green. That's the Lambeosaurines jump into Asia. Then yellow, that's one group of Lambeosaurs jumps from Asia into Europe. And then finally, that one little piece in blue, that one little piece of the tree in blue, that one little branch, That's our North African duckbill dinosaur. So what appears to have happened is the duckbill dinosaurs emerge in the early part of the late Cretaceous in North America, migrate to Asia, migrate to Europe, and then finally to Africa. So what's the problem here? The question is, how did duckbill dinosaurs go from North America to North Africa? Again, the Tethys seaway has been isolating Laurasian Gondwana for over 150 million years at this point, or over about 100 million years at this point. So how do they get across this seaway? And even if we could account for that, we have another problem. We have this strait called the Turgai Strait that separates Europe and Asia at this point. How did they get across the Turgai Strait into Europe in the first place? So we have this migration pattern from North America into North Africa, but we have two seaways standing in our way. And so it seems impossible that duckbill dinosaurs could get there, and yet we have them in North Africa. So what could be explaining this? So one theory, a theory that probably people would have put out many years ago when these types of theories were more in vogue, is that continental drift could explain everything. Is duckbill dinosaurs simply migrated from one part of the supercontinent to another back when these land connections. And this seems very plausible. It seems very intuitive. It seems quite obvious that this could explain things, but it all comes down to the timing. And the problem is the timing is just wrong for this. Is the continents are starting to break up, back in the Jurassic period around 150 million years ago, and this duckbill is appearing in North Africa around 66 million years ago, tens of millions of years later, almost 100 million years later. So the timing is just all wrong. The seaways are older than the dinosaur groups that they're separating. So if the seaways have appeared before the duckbill dinosaurs, something else has to be going on here. So one hypothesis is that there could be some sort of land bridge. And again, this seems plausible. The problem is we have no geological evidence for a continuous land bridge between Europe and North Africa. There might be an intermittent land bridge potentially, like little islands coming up, little island continents emerging between Africa, North and Europe, but we don't have any good evidence for an actual continuous land bridge at this point. And the other thing is that the biogeographic signal isn't there. When you get a land bridge, you have very similar faunas on either side of that land bridge, like in North America and South America, because things just move back and forth like there's no barrier, because there is no barrier. But we still have a lot of faunal distinctiveness between North Africa and Europe. They're not the same fauna, just this one little shared element of the duckbill dinosaurs. So that left us with one other possibility: oceanic dispersal. Could duckbill dinosaurs swim between these land masses? And this seems really implausible, but could dinosaurs cross oceans? And if so, how might they do that? So one possibility is that animals could simply swim long distances. Deer, for example, are known to swim, something like 20 miles in open water, in lakes and in oceans, out to islands where they go feeding. So they're able to swim quite long distances. Elephants turn out to be amazing swimmers, and elephants can swim at speeds of almost 3 kilometers an hour for distances approaching 50 kilometers. And again, they'll swim out to islands and go feed there. And we see that during the Pleistocene, during the last ice age, elephants and deer would colonize oceanic islands. Islands like Crete and Sardinia and Cyprus. Elephants colonized the Channel Islands in California. So we know that animals are able to swim relatively long distances, tens of kilometers, between land masses to colonize them. We've seen that. The record is held by polar bears for swimming. So polar bears are kind of semi-aquatic. They don't really dive, but they do swim routinely long distances out to sea ice and between patches of sea ice. And they have a modest amount of aquatic adaptation. They have some webbing between the toes. They have very dense fur. The eyes are a bit elevated on the skull so they can see out of the water. And the record for swimming by a polar bear is they observed using a radio transmitting collar, a polar bear swimming for 9 days, 687 kilometers. And as best we can tell, there was no ice or land along the way where the bear could haul out and rest or sleep. It went without sleeping, without feeding, without resting for 9 days for almost 700 kilometers. So animals are able to swim very long distances across the ocean with relatively minor degrees of specialization for long distance swimming. So if we look at the duckbill dinosaurs, it seems like they might have been fairly good swimmers. They're fairly big animals. Big animals tend to be better swimmers than small animals, it seems. They have very deep tails they could use for propulsion, like an oar. big, powerful legs, big feet. They could kind of kick with these, kind of like a duck. So these guys might have been pretty good swimmers. And there is some evidence to suggest that duckbill dinosaurs were more aquatic than most dinosaurs. Duckbill dinosaurs are very common in river deposits. So if we go out, for example, the late Cretaceous of Western North America, the channel sands, the rivers are full of duckbill dinosaurs, and they're less common in more inland settings. We also find that they're the most common group of dinosaurs in marine rocks. So a number of species like Hadrosaurus, Plesiosaurus, Lophorodon, Eotrachodon, Tethys Augustinolophus are found in marine rocks. So that suggests they might be swimming fairly often compared to other dinosaurs. They might be better at swimming and more inclined to swim. So that's one potential way you can move a dinosaur between one continent and another. Another possibility is drifting. Could animals simply passively drift long distances? And some animals float really well. So is this a plausible dispersal mechanism? Can we simply have animals bobbing along passively long distances? And yes, this turns out to be realistic. The most extraordinary example that we know of this, it is an anecdote, but a very interesting illustrative anecdote, is a tortoise was found, an Aldabra tortoise was found on mainland Africa near Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And this tortoise appears to have, it's an Aldabra tortoise that appears to have come from Aldabra 700 kilometers away and drifted for weeks at sea and washed up on the shores of Africa. And it had been at sea for so long that it had barnacles growing all over it. And yet when it washed up alive. So it spent weeks at sea, 700 kilometers, and floated up alive. Now you can imagine that if this happened over thousands of years, potentially maybe a pregnant female washes between one landmass and another and colonizes an island. And this is probably how the Galapagos Islands were colonized and how Aldabra was colonized in the first place, is the tortoises are just kind of, they don't swim very well. They just kind of float along. They're swept out to sea. They wash up on an island, they colonize it. So floating is a possibility for colonizing land masses. Now, could dinosaurs float? It might seem counterintuitive because they're really big. But if you think about it, really big things like super tankers, oil tankers, and aircraft carriers float quite well. The reason they float is that they're less dense than water. So you can be very big and float quite well if you're less dense than water. And dinosaurs were probably a bit less dense than water. And certain dinosaurs in particular seem to have been very low density. And surprisingly, the least dense dinosaurs are probably the biggest ones, the sauropod dinosaurs. And the reason why is to lighten their skeletons, they have these pneumatic pockets. The bones are hollowed out and filled with air like the bones of a bird. So all these chambers that you see in this sauropod neck vertebra here are air-filled. And so these animals will be quite buoyant. Not only are they buoyant, because the neck and the back are less buoyant than the rest of the animal, they would tend to float upright. They'd have a low center of gravity and would be self-righting like a ship. And then the neck is air-filled and would be very difficult to submerge. So if they're drifting along, even if they fell asleep or lost consciousness, the neck would be pushed up out of the water like the collar of a life preserver, keeping them afloat and upright and keeping them from drowning. And conceivably, these dinosaurs could drift, I don't know, tens or hundreds of kilometers across the open ocean. So we have swimming, we have floating, and the third possibility for crossing long distances across water is rafting. And sometimes animals are swept out to sea on natural rafts. They can be swept out to sea on vegetation, on logs, or on ice. And here's an example that I found on the internet. Some people, I believe this was in Newfoundland, they're out to sea on a boat, maybe a fishing boat or something, and they spot something on an iceberg. And they pull up to see what it is, and it's a little Arctic fox. And they rescue the fox and take it back to land. Now, most of the time, if something is swept out to sea, nobody's going to find it and take it back to land, of course. So most of the time, these events end quite unhappily for the animals swept out to sea. But every once in a while, you can imagine an animal swept out to sea on an iceberg or some vegetation and washes up on another landmass and colonizes it. And this might not happen often, but it could potentially happen often enough to explain how it is that animals cross water and colonize islands. And again, we have anecdotes showing that this has in fact happened. So we have an example of a successful rafting event in 1995. There was a hurricane and a bunch of iguanas washed up on the island of Anguilla on a raft of vegetation on floating debris. And as best we can tell, these iguanas came from the island of Guadalupe, 500 kilometers away. So again, this doesn't happen often. Most of the time, animals swept out to sea simply drown, but every once in a while, they wash up on an island, they wash up on a landmass and colonize it. So long distance rafting, oceanic rafting, probably explains how lizards get out to islands. We have the example, for example, of Galapagos iguanas. How did they get there? Probably swept out to sea on vegetation, like those iguanas in the Caribbean, and washed up on the Galapagos. And this might seem implausible and it might seem crazy, and how likely is this to happen? But somehow they got to the Galapagos where there's never been a land connection. It just rose up out of the ocean. So they must have washed out there somehow, and rafting is the most likely possibility. This is not even close to the most extreme example of rafting, however. There's a lot of examples of this on the various island faunas, and the most extreme that I'm aware of is another example from iguanas. There are iguanas in Fiji, and there are no iguanas nearby in Australia or New Zealand or Polynesia or Asia. The closest relatives of these iguanas in Fiji are in North and South America, 10,000 kilometers away. So these animals are not only swept out to sea and washed up on this island, they successfully traveled 10,000 kilometers, something like a third of the way around the world to colonize this island. So crazy things happen. Could this explain dinosaur distribution? You might think that dinosaurs wouldn't raft very well because they're quite large. However, even really big dinosaurs come from really tiny eggs. So here we have a nest of an oviraptorosaur, and the eggs are about the size of a potato. So the babies would have been quite small, much smaller than iguana, could potentially raft on floating vegetation. We have a little ceratopsian here, a protoceratops, and it's about the size of a rat. And even giant dinosaurs like T-Rexes, their babies are about the size of a chicken. Giant sauropod dinosaurs, again, the babies weigh a couple kilos. They're about the size of an iguana. So the big ones probably couldn't ride on vegetation, they're just too big, but small dinosaurs could conceivably be washed long distances. So when I started looking at the fossil record, I started seeing that there were a lot of examples of places where dinosaurs are showing up where they just really shouldn't show up. So we have a number of examples of dinosaurs moving between land masses late in the Cretaceous after these seaways have formed. We have sauropod dinosaurs going into North America. We have duckbill dinosaurs going into South America, going into Eastern North America. We have sauropods moving between, Europe and Asia. We're still trying to figure out these dispersal patterns. And then finally, we have duckbill dinosaurs colonizing Europe, and then duckbill dinosaurs colonizing Africa. So something like a dozen different events where we have to invoke some combination of swimming, drifting, or rafting to get dinosaurs between these land masses and across these seaways. So I think the important thing to think about is seeing evolution in terms of impossibility and improbability. Now, Sherlock Holmes famously said, once you eliminate the impossible, then whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. So it might seem really, really unlikely, really improbable that animals could travel long distances between continents, that dinosaurs could be crossing these seaways. It's very, very improbable, but it's not impossible. So continental drift is impossible because the land connections are too ancient. It just doesn't work. When we eliminate land bridges and continental drift, they're impossible. The geology doesn't support it. We're left with merely improbable, and we have to prefer that. And this gives us a very interesting way of looking at evolution. The thing is, when you look at deep time, hundreds of millions of years, it does weird things to probability. And improbable events happen rarely by definition, and we're very unlikely to experience them because we live such short lives. Like the average human lives much less than 100 years. And so rare improbable events rarely affect us. We are unlikely to be bitten by a shark, struck by lightning, or win the lottery. But what if you could live for 1 million years, 10 million years, 100 million years? You'd probably be bit by a shark a lot of times, struck by lightning many times, and win the lottery many times. The thing is, over vast spans of time, rare events become probable. The improbable becomes probable. So what does this mean for understanding evolution? Darwin argued that given enough time, the slow action of everyday processes, common processes, things like predation of birds on insects or competition for birds for food, could drive evolution. So bird predation, the birds eliminate the conspicuous moths and we're left with the camouflage moths. Competition between birds causes them to evolve in different directions. They're competing for food every day. Mate choice influences what survives and what doesn't survive. And this isn't wrong. Given, enough time, the gradual action of every processes will reshape species. However, it's an incomplete view of evolution because given huge periods of time, other rare, improbable events will start coming into play. So with enough time, these low probability, high impact events will inevitably play a role. So some of these events are really bad luck. They can be massive volcanic eruptions, ice ages, asteroid impacts. Other events are good luck. The successful rafting across 1,000 kilometers of open ocean is an improbable fortune event. Improbable adaptations are very complex and unlikely to evolve. Given enough time, will evolve. Other rare events, things like genome duplications or gene duplications don't happen often, but can really reshape the evolution of a lineage. And I argue that over huge spans of time, it's not just the everyday events that drive evolution, but these rare improbable events. And in particular, if you look at biogeography, we have to invoke a lot of these long distance rafting events. So when the asteroid hits, it wipes out the fauna worldwide, wipes out all the dinosaurs, most of the mammals, and the terrestrial ecosystems have to rebuild themselves. And when they're doing this, they're being rebuilt by mammals, but they're isolated. So Africa in the early Cenozoic is isolated by water. It's surrounded by water like Australia is today. And yet in the wake of this extinction, Africa is being colonized multiple times by rodents, by afrotheres, by anomaloid rodents. There's another, in addition to the hystricinae rodents, by hippos, by the extinct hyenodonts, by lemuriform primates, and by anthropoid primates. So Africa's fauna these are all lineages coming in from Laurasia. After the asteroid impact, when it's isolated by water, they're rafting in or swimming to Africa. And Madagascar, likewise, its fauna is crossing water to get there. So we have lemurs, tenrecs, aye-ayes, civets, and hippos are getting to Madagascar, crossing the Mozambique Channel. In South America is colonized by primates several times, actually. Xenarthrans, we don't know when they're getting there, possibly in Cretaceous, but because the mammals, the placentals in general come from the Northern Hemisphere, they must be crossing water to get there. We have the notoungulates, caviomorph rodents, raccoons, and the marsupials are all coming in from the Northern Hemisphere, and they're crossing water to get there to create this South American fauna after the asteroid impact. If we look at Australia, again, Australia is being colonized by water. So mice come in quite late, coming from Asia, but marsupials are coming from South America at a time that it was isolated by water. Marsupials are not endemic to Australia originally. They are coming from South America, and before then, they came from North America. And the monotremes appear to be getting there, probably swimming from South America. Monotremes are not an Australian lineage, they're a South American lineage. So Australia's mammal fauna, again, is being built up by swimming, rafting, or drifting, some combination of these. India, again, is an island continent when its mammal fauna begins to evolve in the Cenozoic, and perissodactyls appear to come from India, had to cross water to get there. Primates, at least two different lineages, colonized India when it was isolated, and then whales. And it might seem crazy to think about whales as an example of oceanic dispersal, but the first whales, when they originally are evolving in India, were semi-aquatic, not fully aquatic animals. They were kind of like otters, and they probably swam across the ocean to colonize the rivers and lakes of India, and then later became fully marine animals. And even North America. So the Great American Interchange, where we have these North America and South America collide, and we have the northern mammals go south and the southern mammals go north. Most of this is driven by the land bridge. However, a few lineages cross early before the Isthmus of Panama is completed. Before there's a complete land bridge, the raccoons go south and the sloths move north. And so probably island hopping, this chain of islands between North and South America. So again, we have an example. This is the classic example of a land bridge dispersal. But as the land bridge is forming, it makes oceanic dispersal more likely. This has really interesting implications for human evolution. So humans and apes evolved in Africa. Primates did not. Primates are not an African lineage. We're not quite sure where they evolved. They might evolve in Asia, they might evolve in North America, but they did not evolve in Africa. They colonized Africa quite late in the Cenozoic, around 55 million years ago for the lemurs, around 45 million years ago for the ape ancestors. Then they start going from Africa into South America and the Caribbean, even North America. But what this means is that our ancestors, the ancestors of Homo sapiens, result from a long-distance oceanic rafting event that brought our ancestors, our primate ancestors, these proto-monkeys from maybe Europe, maybe Asia to Africa. Now think of how improbable this is, and think of all the ways this could go wrong. Maybe there's a flood, maybe there's a hurricane, maybe there's a big storm, and these primates, being primates, they run up the trees, and then the trees are uprooted by a flood, swept down a river, and swept out to sea. And we have this population, these little proto-monkeys, clinging terrified to the trees, watching the land drift away. And think of all the ways this could go wrong. If they died of thirst because it was too dry, if they starved to death because they were at sea for too long, if it took too long to make the crossing, if the raft of vegetation is washed up on a desert island or foundered on a reef, if when they were finally washed ashore, there's a predator there and it ate them, if the founding population was all males or all females, any number of things could have gone wrong, and our ancestors wouldn't have colonized Africa. And in all probability, something like this happened many times, maybe hundreds of times. Maybe hundreds of times over millions of years, primates were swept out to sea, and most of them perished. But then one lineage actually made it to Africa and evolved into the apes, evolved into the monkeys, and ultimately us. So human evolution is dependent on the success, the unlikely success of one of these long-distance oceanic rafting events. So what does this say about the role of chance in evolution? If you look at today's mammal fauna, a huge proportion of all mammals and all land animals, you see similar patterns in lizards and in snakes and in frogs, are the result of successful long-distance oceanic dispersals. A lot of successful groups, important groups, things like elephants, whales, horses, monkeys, and apes, including humans, descend from the lucky survivors of these rafting events. And so these low probability, high impact events have a huge effect on evolution. They don't happen often, but they can completely reshape the evolution of life on Earth and lead to the evolution of completely novel groups, things like elephants and humans. And it didn't have to happen this way. Any slight variation in the currents, in the wind, etc., in elephants or whales or humans don't come into existence and don't evolve. And so that kind of, that's what, and so that's kind of, I don't know, kind of the unlikely journey of this dinosaur kind of led me to this exploration, these unlikely events and how they help drive evolution. And I just kind of like to thank all my collaborators in Morocco who helped make this project possible, and thank you guys for listening.
Thank you.
Hello, yeah, I'm still around, Nick. Wonderful.
Okay.
I really enjoyed your presentation. Very well done.
Okay.
You were well worth the waiting. So just
Thank you.
one
Sorry for that. I
quick,
got confused the time zones. I just got back
this
yesterday and kind of jet
this
lagged.
is all fine. Just coming back to Hadrosaurus, I can imagine that mammals, like polar bears or deer, can swim in the sea for hours or for days. But how about the reptiles? Well, of course, iguana are reptiles, and snakes can. But it depends on the water temperature. So if the seas were freezing cold, I just can't see any reptile dispersing large distances. Sorry.
Yeah, no. Well, okay, that's a good point. So one thing to think about is that it was much warmer in the past. In the Eocene, 55 million years ago, it's incredibly warm. And so this opens up all these. So today, most of the examples we have of recent dispersal events are, reptiles in tropical settings. So like Galapagos land iguanas, for example, are a classic example of oceanic dispersal, or maybe anoles in the Caribbean. So a lot of our examples of rafting are low latitude, they're tropical islands, like the Caribbean, the Galapagos, Madagascar. We don't have a lot of good examples of oceanic dispersal in the Arctic. And that's probably because it's too damn cold up there. But, back in the Eocene period, you had palm trees in Greenland. You had alligators in the Arctic Circle. It was very, very warm. And so you could easily have high latitude oceanic dispersal of reptiles and other animals too. So you think of mammals swimming. Well, the big issue with mammals swimming long distance is hypothermia. Polar bears had adaptations in terms of the fur and the fat to keep them warm, but most animals can't swim long distance to the ocean in the Arctic because they'll freeze. But if the water was a lot warmer, it would be much easier to swim long distances. So climate plays a huge role in determining what's possible. So floating or swimming becomes much more likely, I'd argue, in the Eocene, the Paleocene, or Cretaceous when it's warm, and all these dispersal events are much, much easier. And now today, the one counterexample I can think of about the only oceanic dispersal at high latitudes I can think of is the Falklands Island wolf. And we don't know, it's kind of this obscure fact, but there used to be an endemic mammal in the Falkland Islands. There was this canid, and it's now extinct, and nobody knew how the hell it got there. And for a long time, they thought maybe humans brought it there or something, but they sequenced the DNA and they showed that it's actually a distinct species. It's not a domestic dog or not something humans brought. It's a distinct species related to the maned wolf. And probably what happened is either there was an ice sheet that it walked across, or it was swept out to sea on an iceberg. But this is very, very rare. And it's rare because it's cold. It's very hard it's hard to cross long distances on icebergs or certainly through water in cold water.
I need to go. Excellent talk,
Okay.
Nick, but wonderful. Yeah,
Yeah, all
Gergely,
right.
would you mind running the show? And many thanks for giving this exciting stuff. Okay, thank you very
Yeah,
much. See
sure.
you later. Yeah,
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody.
Okay, see you, Tamás. So we have time for more questions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I'm actually interested that, do we have information about how the nest of these duckbill dinosaurs look like? The nest structure?
The nest?
Yeah.
Yeah, they have clusters of eggs buried in a mound of vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem to me that it'd be something that could easily disperse long distances. It's buried in the soil, and I don't see how it could be uprooted, although occasionally there are floating islands have been described. Wallace talks about them, just whole stands of trees, 100 meters across, just ripped up and swept out to sea. So I could imagine that if a dinosaur built a nest on something like this, the whole thing was uprooted and swept out to sea, you could imagine it being dispersed long distances. I'm not aware of any good anecdotal evidence of animals spreading that way, but you could imagine if lizards lay their eggs on a tree and it's swept out to sea, it could happen. And so, yeah, it's certainly possible.
But do you think the eggs can survive this migration in the ocean?
If they were kept free of salt water, if they were exposed to salt water, they would be dehydrated and killed, I would imagine. So they'd have to be kept above the water somehow. And it's certainly possible. I guess definitely you could imagine the eggs could survive a long period at sea. So they would have that advantage because these eggs have a incubation period of months to years, maybe. And so they could survive weeks and weeks without food or water because they're a little self-contained thing. But they'd have to be kept out of the salt water to avoid desiccation. I don't know. I've struggled. I've been very interested in understanding these floating islands that Wallace talks about, but I can't find any descriptions of them. And I can't find any publications on them. They're a thing that appears in literature. People say they've seen them, but no one ever seems to photograph them or film them or anything. But it seems like it'd be an interesting field project is, get a little float plane or something or a helicopter and find some of these floating rafts of vegetation, go study them and see what's on them. Would be a really interesting project. I don't know how easy they are to find, but my understanding is after a flood season, off the coast of South America or Africa, you have big rafts of vegetation. And it'd be interesting to get like a boat and go out there and see them. And what's on them? I don't know. I have no idea, but it'd just be a very interesting naturalistic project to do. And it'd be a fun adventure, I guess, too.
Yeah,
So,
I agree. So I ask the audience, if you have any questions, please free to ask.
oh, there we go. What's this chat? Yeah, that's a very good question. There's a whole series of filters that you can imagine being imposed on these dispersal events. And you have to cross not just one threshold, but a bunch of thresholds. One of them is that your population must be maybe sufficiently large to be genetically diverse. It has to have males and females. And then once you wash up on the other continent, then you have a whole series of other problems that you're encountering. And there's predators. Are things going to eat you? There might be competitors. Is the environment hostile? There's all these other problems come up. And there is, in addition to these physical barriers, the ocean, there's what I call the biotic barrier to dispersal. A good example of this, I mean, it might seem, maybe it's not exactly biology, but kind of is the colonization of the New World. Is why didn't the Norse, the Vikings, why didn't they successfully colonize North America? They're coming in, they've got, very advanced technology, they've got these long boats, they've got wheat and grains and cows and iron and all this technology, but they arrive in North America and their colonization event fails. And the reason it fails is they're warring with the American Indians. And the American Indians, although using Stone Age technology, had been there for thousands of years. And they knew how to live off the land. They understood it intimately in a way the Vikings didn't, and they drove the Vikings off. So the Vikings were unable to successfully colonize the New World. And then when the English came in, and the Spanish, a big part of the reason they were able to successfully colonize the New World is diseases had been spreading and decimating the local populations. So humans provide a barrier to dispersal of other humans, and you eliminate that through disease, and then all of a sudden the Europeans could colonize. And I don't know, we're an unusual species, but we are animals, and it's an interesting example that we've observed, and we can see that one population prevent another from moving in because they're competing. And I think the same thing happens in the natural world, is often you wash up on this island or on a landmass, and what happens? You get eaten. So why haven't Aldabra tortoises colonized Africa? Because most of the time when an Aldabra tortoise washes up on Africa, it gets eaten by a lion or outcompeted by the local tortoises. Now, what can change that is a mass extinction event. And so you can imagine that after the asteroid hits, the faunas have been devastated. The biodiversity is very, very low. There's very few competitors. There's very few predators. And all of a sudden, the likelihood of a successful long-distance oceanic dispersal event goes up dramatically. It becomes exponentially more likely. So I think what we're seeing after the asteroid impact, when all these lineages are jumping between continents, is there's not a lot of competitors. There's not a lot of predators. And so even though the events happen, the likelihood of an oceanic crossing doesn't change that much over time, except maybe as a result of the climate. But the likelihood of it taking goes up dramatically after a mass extinction event. And again, the example would be sort of analogous to this is the pandemics that hit the New World after the Europeans made contact are like a mass extinction event. They wipe out the local populations, and it becomes much easier for Europeans to move in and colonize because the indigenous peoples have been decimated. And in the same way, the asteroid impact opens up the world for colonization. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for your nice talk. I have a question. Do we know anything about if dinosaurs also hibernate in colder periods?
That's a good question. There's a lot of arguments about dinosaur physiology. I think the consensus is they tended to have fairly high metabolic rates compared to like a lizard, but maybe not as high as a bird. So that might mean that they could probably they might be able to go for food longer than mammals could. But I mean, there's a lot of variation. Some dinosaurs had higher metabolic rates, probably some had lower. But if their metabolic rates were lower and a bit more like a reptile, they might be able to spend longer periods of time at sea without starving. And some dinosaurs, like the sauropod dinosaurs, we're not really sure what's going on with them, but some people think they might be more like a reptile in certain ways. And again, if they had low metabolic rates, that even if I don't know if there's any evidence that any of them could actually go into hibernation, but it's not impossible. And just if they did have a lower resting metabolic rate, that might allow them to disperse relatively long distances. So today we see a lot more lizards on islands than mammals. And the thinking is that just lizards can survive for long periods at sea without food, without water, and mammals just tend to starve quite quickly. So a small mammal like a rat can maybe starve in days, and a lizard can survive weeks or months without food. And there is a rodent on the Galapagos Islands, the Galapagos rice rat, but it's sort of the exception. Most of the oceanic dispersals, most of these islands have a lot of lizards and very few mammals. So if dinosaurs are a bit more lizard-like, that might make it easier for them to disperse.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's a bit tricky because there are a few general patterns in extinction. Generally speaking, large animals are more vulnerable. Specialists are more vulnerable, and widespread species are less vulnerable. So if you're endemic and specialized and large, you have a much higher risk of extinction. And that's something that seems to generalize across different extinction events. However, every extinction event is a bit different. So you see very different patterns in, say, the Triassic mass extinction than the Cretaceous mass extinction. The Triassic mass extinction sees the extinction of a lot of aquatic lineages. So there are these giant amphibians called metoposaurs, they go extinct. There's these crocodile-like things called phytosaurs, they go extinct, and various other freshwater lineages go extinct. And then in the Jurassic, we have the appearance of things like, aquatic crocodilians and turtles moving into these vacant niches. And then they survived until today because when the asteroid hit, freshwater was a good place to be. It's not entirely clear why, but when the asteroid hit, it seems that animals in freshwater like crocodiles and turtles and fish were spared the temperature fluctuations. So there may have been some heating from the ejecta. There was definitely cooling in the aftermath. So these big temperatures, fluctuations, heating and cooling, being in water, they were protected. And then when everything dies, all washes into the streams. So you have a detritus that's feeding invertebrates, it's feeding insect larvae, it's feeding snails, and those things then feed fish and crocodiles and turtles. So in one extinction event, we have a huge extinction of freshwater species. And then when the asteroid impacts, we have a low extinction of freshwater species. So we have very different patterns of selectivity. And likewise, we have extinction events associated with extreme global warming, like the Cenomanian Turonian event. And then we have extinction events associated with cooling, like the Eocene-Oligocene event. So every extinction is different. And then with the most recent extinction event in the Pleistocene, that's associated with human hunting. So species that are large and tasty, easy to hunt, and slow to reproduce are preferentially wiped out. So I think the dinosaur, and then now what's happening is something a bit different. It's less driven by hunting and more by things like habitat modification, habitat destruction for farming and for forestry and things like that. So I think that one of the lessons from mass extinction is every mass extinction is different. They have different rules, different survivorship patterns, and it's difficult to generalize. I'm trying to think of what else, I guess, kind of next steps is I probably need to write up all some of these ideas at some point. There has been more kind of a move towards reinterpreting biogeography through dispersal in recent years. And for a long time, everybody was trying to see everything through this lens of continental drift. And that was the prevailing paradigm. And it's basically fallen apart as we've gotten better models of the geology, the paleogeography, and molecular clocks in the fossil record. It's become very clear that most groups that are widespread today became widespread quite recently, not back when the continents were united. And I think but I think we still haven't appreciated just how important these dispersal events are. I've kind of looked at it, Cenozoic mammals. Doing dinosaurs is very complicated though, because we don't understand the relationships between a lot of these groups, like our evolutionary trees are constantly shifting. And every time your evolutionary tree shifts, it can tell you a different biogeographic story. So until these trees kind of stabilize, we're still struggling to figure out which dinosaurs came from one place to another. Another thing we probably need to look at is things like lizards and snakes and frogs and try to map these trees onto the world. But again, what we're seeing is groups like iguanas that are widespread today. Iguanas emerged after the asteroid impact at 66 million years ago. probably in North America. And yet iguanas are widespread throughout North America and South America. There's some in Madagascar. How are they moving and when did they move and which groups moved? That's kind of complicated, but would be good to work out. Snakes are another group that there's been a lot of very recent radiations that would require overwater dispersal. Turtles are one of the few groups that don't spread a lot over water, curiously. I don't know. I'm not sure why. They don't seem to survive long periods at sea. Maybe they dehydrate in salt water, or maybe they swim for shore, or anyway. But and then probably another thing to be really interesting to look at would be plants. Is how and when do various plant groups spread between continents? And they spread very readily, just floating seeds and trees and things like that. And so there's just a whole series of groups that we kind of need to sit down and map out. Where do they start? How do they spread? And how do these dispersal patterns, how do they count for modern diversity? I would assume invertebrates too, like spiders, presumably. I'm just guessing there's a lot of recent dispersal events of flightless invertebrates, things like spiders and millipedes and whatnot, centipedes, who knows? And there's a huge amount to be done here. So kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, thank you, Nick.
Okay.
I think the time is up. So if we have one last question, maybe that's it. Other than that, thank you for your attention and Nick,
okay, thank you guys so much. And
seems that's it. So
okay.
Okay, good luck on your work. See you next time.
Okay, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.